The snow fell with the delicacy of an ancient silence, slowly covering the floor of the asylum's garden, the trees shrunken by the cold, and the horizon that was lost in white. Inside the house, warmed by a tired fireplace, a lady remained motionless in front of the large, worn wooden window. Wrapped in a woolen shawl, her hands rested in her lap, while her eyes remained fixed on a distant point. There was something in that look that didn't belong in the present. He passed through time, frozen, together with the memories of a life that few there knew. Every morning, at 6 o'clock sharp, she sat there, always looking in the same direction. For 23 winters in a row, the clock showed the same time. The sound of the nurse's footsteps passing through the corridor was the same. The steam from the tea recently placed on the table next to it dissipated in the same way. And she, every day, in the same silent ritual. I didn't talk to anyone. He never answered questions. He accepted the coffee with a slight nod and kept his eyes focused on the same spot behind the glass where the snow had fallen for decades without response. Some said she was waiting for someone, others who saw something that no one else could see. To the new employees, she was just the lady at the window. But the ancients knew winter was colder when she didn't appear. Her name was Anya, and although it had been there as long as the walls of that remote asylum, few knew anything about it. I didn't receive visitors. He had no relatives. I didn't ask for anything. He just watched, with eyes that seemed to hold secrets that only ice knew. Her room was simple, adorned by a single old photograph, in black and white, of a young man in uniform, and a small silver reliquary that she kept close to her chest as she slept. Outside, the landscape remained unchanged, trees covered in snow, a forest in the distance, and a road that led nowhere. But that was where she looked, always, as if waiting for something to appear out of the white. A figure, a shadow, a response. The asylum routine was repeated day after day. Muted laughter, low conversations, the distant sound of the television in another room. But next to her, the world seemed suspended, as if time respected your silence, as if even the wind stopped to hear what she never said. She was part of that frozen landscape, a living figure framed by the window between the warmth of the fireplace and the cold of memory. That particular winter, however, something was about to change. What no one knew was that, at the end of that white road that Anya watched with such silent hope, a new resident was arriving. And with it, a story from the same village. A story that had not yet been told. A memory that I no longer wanted to sleep under the snow. The asylum was isolated among frozen forests, where winter seemed to last all year round. Snow on the roof, silence on the balconies, and inside, simple routines. Nurses walking slowly through the warm corridors, tea served punctually, and low voices echoing between the wooden rooms. The fireplace in the main hall crackled all day long, warming the tired hands of those who had already watched too much time pass by. Most elderly people found solace in routine conversations or repeated memories, but not Anya. She was different. He didn't talk about the past, nor did he ask about the present. It was as if his story was kept under the ice of time. They said she had lost her husband at a young age, that she never saw him again after a particularly cruel winter. But no one knew for sure, and she never confirmed it. Everyone just learned to respect their silence. Some said he was waiting for someone, others that they had left something frozen at that exact point on the horizon. But no one dared to ask directly. It was part of the landscape, like the snow on the trees, like the distant sound of the wind hitting the windows. If you also feel that there are stories that need to be told and heard, subscribe to the channel Frozen Chronicles. Because in places like this, between the snow and the silence, the deepest memories live. The days followed one another with the silent predictability typical of life in frozen regions. With each new dawn, the intense whiteness of the snow covered the courtyard, the empty benches, the path between the trees twisted by the cold, renew the scene of isolation around the asylum. Inside, the world seemed to have learned to move slowly. The nurses' steps were restrained, their dialogues were short, their gestures were small. Everything there was done with care, as if any sudden movement could break the delicate balance of the residents' routine. But even in this silent, predictable environment, there was something about Anya's presence that stood out. A silent force that caught the eye of anyone passing by, even if she didn't say a single word. She was always there, sitting in that thick fabric armchair, strategically positioned in front of the largest window in the room. In front of him, the frozen forest that, to everyone's eyes, seemed just a white and repetitive scenery. But for her, that view had layers, stories, absences. His eyes seemed to search for something specific, as if every ice-covered branch might hide a fragment of an answer. There was no boredom in that look. There was intensity, persistence. She observed like someone with a time commitment. The caregivers over the years stopped trying to involve her in activities. Anya didn't play cards, she didn't participate in conversation circles, nor did she accept invitations to the small events that occasionally broke up the winter monotony. He was kind, but always absent. Physical presence was the most he offered. No one ever saw her smile, not even during the holidays, when the hallways had discreet lights and a children's choir came to sing Christmas carols. She watched from afar, with the same gaze that returned day after day to the window. She was also never seen walking through the front door. Since arriving more than 2 decades ago, Anya seemed to have no need to leave. It was said that she didn't like the cold, which seemed ironic given where she lived. But those who watched closely knew that was not the case. She just didn't need to go outside. Because what she expected was right there, in that direction, on that invisible line between the edge of the forest and the gray sky. It was as if she was waiting for a sign that only she could recognize. A figure appearing between the trees. A return that the world had already forgotten, but she hadn't. And always attached to her neck, under the fabric of her dark dress, was the small silver reliquary that she never took off. In a few rare moments when he drifted off to sleep in the armchair and his head fell gently on his shoulder, it was possible to see the thin chain glisten in the morning light. They say that inside was an old photograph and perhaps a lock of hair. But no one ever had the courage to ask. It was as if touching that object would break the spell that kept her there, steadfast in her vigil of almost a quarter of a century. This mystery was not often talked about. There was a silent respect in the air, the kind of reverence that only time can command. Anya was as much a part of the landscape as the heavy curtains or the old pictures on the walls. His silence was almost sacred, as if layers of emotional snow were spreading around her, covering memories that didn't want to be unearthed. And yet there was something magnetic about that presence. The new caregivers were always surprised and tried to understand, but it only took a few weeks for them to accept that it was part of that world, a code that would not be deciphered. The most sensitive said that she was trapped between 2 times, that the body was there, but the soul still wandered through a frozen past. Maybe that's why winter seemed more intense in the room where she stayed. As if the cold around her was different, denser, deeper. As if the snow falling outside wasn't enough to cover what was inside. And no one knew that better than herself. On this particular morning, however, something was different. A subtle movement at the main gate, a new voice being announced, unfamiliar footsteps along the corridors. The kind of change that, in a place so static, sounds like an earthquake. A new resident had just arrived. He brought with him a small suitcase, a woolen coat, and a name: Mikhail. He had been transferred from another asylum far away, but still within the same frozen lands, surrounded by ice and silence. It was common for new residents to cause brief distractions, passing curiosities, but in this case, something deeper was about to happen. The past, until then, dormant like the ground beneath the snow, was about to wake up. And the story he carried in his heart could be the same one Anya had been waiting for so many winters. Mikhail arrived on a particularly cold day, the kind where the wind seems to pierce through even the thickest walls. His thick coat bore the marks of a long journey, with snowflakes still stuck to the fabric, and his eyes carried the same kind of silence that inhabited the asylum. He wasn't a very old man, at least not in the eyes of those who had lived there for so long. He had grey hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and a steady expression, like someone who carried heavy memories, but still allowed himself to observe the world carefully. He was received with the usual calm that marked that place. Documents signed, room tidied, a cup of hot tea offered. Nothing there seemed new to him. Mikhail walked through the corridors as if he already knew the steps, as if the sound of wood beneath his feet was familiar. And, in a way, it was. He came from a neighboring village, one of those little clusters of houses buried in snow for half the year. He had grown up among fishermen's stories and legends told around the fire, listening to his elders talk about the changing seasons and the promises made before departure. But it was as he crossed the main hall for the first time that he stopped. His eyes met Anya's, or rather, met the direction of her gaze. What she saw through the window was the same forest as her childhood. He recognized it immediately. The outline of the trees, the curve of the land, even the crooked old trunk in the distance. That forest, he knew. And not just that. He grew up there. He played on those trails covered in dry leaves in the summer and hid among the rocks when the snow started to fall. There too was a house with a veranda, a dark wooden house where a girl lived who, for many years, sat watching the road, as if waiting for someone to return from the war. The memory came to him with force, as if time had frozen that detail inside him until that moment. He didn't know her name, he just remembered her image. Her hair tied up, her posture upright, her gaze distant. It was a childhood image, but it never disappeared. He couldn't say for sure, but everything inside him said it was her. The woman at the window. What I expected. The one that never left. In the days that followed, Mikhail began to discreetly observe her. He sat in a nearby armchair, pretending to read the newspaper, but his eyes searched hers. He tried to greet her, receive a wave, any gesture. Nothing. Anya maintained her routine unchanged, as if his presence were just another passing wind. But in a brief moment, when he casually commented to a nurse that this forest looked a lot like the one in his village, she shook her head slightly. An almost imperceptible sign, but one that did not go unnoticed. Moved by an intuition that not even he could explain, Mikhail began to write. I wrote down memories, pieces of history, forgotten names. He searched his own memories like someone digging through ice in search of something lost. And then he found, at the bottom of an old box, a brooch. Silver, with a small flower carved in the center. He remembered that object on the girl's blouse on the porch on a distant afternoon, when the war was still just a whisper in the children's ears. He put the brooch in his pocket. I still didn't know what I would do with him, but something told him that this small fragment of the past was the key to opening something that had been frozen for a long time. And for the first time since he arrived, Mikhail didn't feel the biting cold. There was something there between him and that silent woman that defied time and snow. maybe it was just coincidence, or maybe not. Sometimes in the coldest regions of the world, stories frozen waiting for a reunion know exactly when to awaken. And you, have you ever met someone who seemed to carry a piece of your own memory? Tell us in the comments. The stories that unite souls in the silence of winter deserve to be remembered. On the third day, Mikhail decided to try something more direct. He approached Anya without books, without distractions, just with the brooch in his hand, wrapped in a piece of cloth, as if he were carrying something sacred. She was, as always, in the same position, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their bodies serene, and the air between them as thick as the snow outside. He didn't say anything right away. He just sat to the side, respecting the silence that seemed to rule that place with more authority than any rule. Minutes passed. The wind whistled outside, cutting between the cracks in the wood, and inside there was only the timid crackling of the distant fireplace. Mikhail then placed the brooch on the small table next to her armchair. He didn't touch her, nor did he try to get her attention with words. He just left the object there like someone leaving a note for time. She didn't react immediately, but at some point his eyes, which until then had insisted on the same spot beyond the forest, slightly shifted away, and they landed on that. The silence became even denser. Anya looked at the brooch for a long moment. Her breathing changed. The hand, which remained motionless on her lap, trembled slightly before moving. Gently, she touched the object, turned it between her fingers, and for a very brief moment, her eyes closed. It was as if she had returned to a place kept only within her. When he opened his eyes again, he looked directly at Mikhail for the first time. The look was not surprising. It was about recognition. He, with a low and firm voice, finally spoke. He said that brooch belonged to the girl his older brother loved, that he found it among the stored letters, among things that time could not erase. He said that, as a child, he heard her name whispered among forbidden memories, between sentences interrupted when adults became aware of her presence. He said his brother went off to war with that name on his lips and never came back. My brother, he talked about you before he left. He loved you, and I kept it all these years. The words came out with more pain than he expected, because there before him was the woman his brother never forgot. And also, perhaps, the only one who never really let him go. She didn't cry, but his eyes were full of something that only time could mature. She held the brooch tightly, as if something finally clicked inside her, as if the winter, until then constant, had given way for a brief moment. Little by little, the frozen tension between the two began to dissolve. Mikhail sat a little closer, with the care of someone who doesn't want to scare a bird. Nothing else was needed. The past was there, breathing between them. There was no rush, no questions, just the presence, and that was more than enough. If this story touched you in any way, leave a like. This helps our channel bring more true and moving stories to those who also believe that even in the coldest places, there are memories that still know how to warm up. The hall seemed brighter that morning. Light came in through the window, as always, through the glass, fogged by the contrast between the heat of the fireplace and the intense cold outside. But there was something different in the air. It was as if the environment itself had taken a deep breath. The armchair was there in the same place as always. The shawl rested on Anya's shoulders like every other day, but his eyes this time were not lost on the horizon. They were facing Mikhail, who now occupied the space next to her naturally, as if he had always been part of that snowy and silent scene. The brooch remained between her fingers, and the warmth of the memory seemed to have melted the layer of ice that separated her from the world. A subtle gesture, but full of meaning, appeared on his face. a smile. Small, delicate, almost imperceptible, but authentic. It was as if something inside her had been restored, as if, after so many winters of waiting, a dormant part of her soul had finally allowed itself to wake up. There was no hurry in his movements. Everything continued at a slow pace, like the rhythm of life itself in that asylum in the midst of the extreme cold. Mikhail, without saying much, did what seemed natural. He extended his hand, offering her a cup of freshly brewed tea. Her hands, always so still before, moved lightly. The heat from the drink rose in the form of steam, in contrast to the cold that still drew crystals outside the window. They had tea together for the first time. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. The silence was now different. A shared silence full of presence, loaded with meanings that only the two of them understood. Those two lives, marked by losses, distances, and frozen memories, now shared an instant that required no words, just existence. Anya no longer just looked outside. She had spent 23 years fixing her eyes on a part of the world that only she understood. But now, something inside her was moving in another direction. For the first time, she turned around, and he looked at someone next to him. The eyes that previously sought an unreachable past now found present humanity, the warmth of unexpected company, the chance to live a new memory, even at the end of life. The asylum continued its serene routine, like every day. But in that corner of the room, in front of that window that was once a portal to the past, there were now two faces, two bodies warmed by tea, two hearts united by stories that crossed paths under the snow. The cold was still around outside. The mountains were still covered in white, and the sky remained gray. But inside that small wooden space, something had changed. And anyone who happened to pass by would realize, sometimes in the coldest regions of the world, true heat comes from the simple gesture of looking to the side. If you also feel that there are stories capable of transforming even the coldest silence, stay here with us on the channel Frozen Chronicles. Because in each episode, a new fragment of life is thawed to warm memories that should never be forgotten. The snow continued to fall outside, making soft shapes on the window pane. The forest in the distance remained silent, enveloped in white, as if time was still standing still outside. But inside, in the asylum hall, the scene had changed. The armchair where Anya sat every morning remained in the same place, facing the large window. But now it was empty. The shawl still rested on the backrest, folded carefully. On the small table next to it, where cups of hall, tea and a forgotten brooch had rested for so long, there was now a small diary with an aged cover with a dried flower carefully placed on it. A symbol of everything that was felt, held, and finally released. There were no grand farewells. It didn't even need to. Everyone there knew in silence that something had been completed. Anya did not leave with sadness. She left with the lightness of someone who had finally found herself. His presence still seemed to fill the room. Not like before, like a waiting silence, but like a warming memory. She no longer waited for the past. She had found peace in the present. Mikhail was still there, looking at the same horizon that before was just hers. But now, he saw it with different eyes. The eyes of someone who helped give meaning to a frozen time. The eyes of someone who was also touched by a story that seemed not to be theirs, but ended up being part of something bigger. A story of emotional survival in the midst of extreme cold, of reconnection in a scenario where even your breath freezes. In the silence of the room, soft music filled the space like a whisper, while the snow outside continued its course, indifferent and eternal. How many stories like this are frozen, just waiting for someone to unfreeze the memory? How many windows hold ancient views? How many reliquaries still carry secrets? Here on the channel Frozen Chronicles, these stories gain a voice, even when said in silence. If this narrative touched you, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to feel this emotion, and write in the comments. Have you ever met someone who seemed to be waiting for something that time forgot? And if you're not already part of this journey, sign up now. Because each story here is more than a memory. It's a piece of the human heart, preserved among snow, time, and the beauty of simply feeling.